welcome to the brand new Open Fire podcast with Dave and Tom. Open Fire is here to provide honest and informed dialogue on fire safety and construction issues through collaboration, research and innovation discussions with some of the fire industry's most prominent and recognised leaders. Your presenters are myself, Dave Calver, Ops Director at Frankham Risk Management Services, and with me in the studio, I have so-called fire expert and CEO of CLM Group, Tom Gilbert. Hello, Tom.
Hello, David. How are you?
Not too bad. What have you been up to this week, Tom?
It's so difficult to remember what I've been doing this week. We're doing lots of good stuff with lots of good clients. We've started on site on some pretty iconic projects, closed out a few this week. So, yeah, been a busy week. You?
Okay. Well, preparing for this, we've obviously got some very exciting guests today. One is our returning guest and friend of the show, Managing Director of Frankham Risk Management Services, and it has to be said, my boss and mentor and friend, John Powell.
Hello.
Hello,
Thank
John.
I prefer you in a tie.
Do you?
I do.
Perhaps next time.
A little more elegant, for sure.
And accompanying John this week, we have Jamie Davies, co-CEO of Part B.
Hello.
Hello,
Who's
Jamie.
my friend?
Allegedly.
Alleged friend.
Both of which are on here, and we're going to delve a little bit into the Building Safety Act, which is the current topic of conversation.
Absolutely. And I think the Building Safety Act is an interesting thing, and I feel like everybody knows what it is, but there's only 8 people that have read it. I feel like that's where we're at a little bit as an industry.
Have you read it, Tom?
Yes, I'm one of the 8.
I've read it.
So half of the people that have ever read it are in this room right now, and
Right.
I know that John will have read it, not about it, and then Jamie will have read it. And I think a lot of the audience will want to hear about the Building Safety Act. And I think there is an interchange between what the Building Safety Act is, what Building Safe for Future is all about, what the Grenfell Tower inquiry is all about. And I think people do kind of interchange them all a little bit and probably not understand what
we
they
had
are.
Dame Judy Hackett early on in the series. And obviously, we talked quite a lot about the Building Safety Act. I think now what we're talking about with John and Jamie is more the nuts and bolts of it and how it's affecting and being used by consultancies and experts within the industry.
Because obviously Dame Judith Hackett didn't write the Building Safety Act.
No.
She wrote Building a Safer Future.
I'm
And
aware of
from
this.
that, we get to the Building Safety Act. And I suppose I'll ask a question I'll go with Jamie first, if you're all right with that, Jamie.
Yeah, sure.
So the question is, to what degree do you think that the Building Safety Act addressed the issues raised within Dame Judith Hackett's Building a Safer Future report?
I think we have to look about the intentions of where the report was coming from.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to look at how the review was undertaken and what Dame Judith was trying to achieve with that. I remember going back and looking at the footage at the time that the Grenfell happened. And I remember I got a text 2:00 in the morning from a colleague and says, turn your telly on. And obviously we all saw what we saw. And I remember looking at that time and thinking that's the type of fire that changes legislation.
Yep.
And of course, we are where we are now, and it's done exactly that. I think where the review was coming from Dame Judith was ultimately to pick up these pertinent issues to ensure that we can build a regulatory regime going forward which satisfies perhaps everybody from, we know from the resident's voice, from the occupier to the people building, to the people designing. And I think fundamentally the spirit of the Building Safety Act has captured that. I think the challenge that we now have moving forward is the application of how that looks in reality and all of the stakeholders adequately buying into that.
Yeah.
That's where I feel with it. But fundamentally, yes, I think it captures the spirit of that, but it's the detail yet that needs to be nutted out.
Yeah, I would concur with that. I think that the what has been introduced by the Building Safety Act is a fair reflection of the outputs that came from Dame Judith's report. We now got a regulatory body in place, namely the regulator, who's there to sort of oversee, to ensure that we've got all the right processes and controls in place. Interestingly, the way the Act is written, it actually seems to imply that the regulator is going to be there as the body who's going to be like approving or is responsible for those controls going forward. And I think when you actually delve into it and you have further conversations with the regulator, there's a different viewpoint on that. The regulator, I think, has been very clear insofar as that they're setting out their stall in saying that we're not there to interrogate all of the submissions that are being put forward to us. We're there really to assess and validate that all of the requirements that have been set out under the Act have been satisfied by all of the professional teams that have been brought together by the principal accountable person to ensure that all of those processes and procedures have been in place and there. So ultimately the responsibility still sits with the PAP. We need to move away from this idea that the regulator's going to be the approving body. They're simply there to say, yeah, okay, based upon what you submitted and the fact that you've put together a good, robust professional team to ensure that what you're putting forward is going to be robust. We can see that through the submissions that you put forward. So therefore, we're going to give you approval to move to the next stage. And I think that's still something that industry needs to get their heads around, because I think there's still this misconception of the idea that we're just going to put this submission through to the regulator and the regulator's going to sign it off and that's it, everything's good. The responsibility still firmly sits with the property owner, i.e. through the PAP, to make sure that happens.
I think that's interesting, and one of the conversations we had with Dame Judith Hackett when she was here a few episodes back now, and she was making the point about how the golden thread is a critical part of this, and how there's a need for records and such like to be held digitally, but how some people were taking this to mean it needed some complex or overly expensive system in order to hold this record and hold this golden thread. I think you've had some involvement in creating a system that's relatively basic and relatively cheap to make it accessible. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Dame Judith is right in that I think there is a danger that these systems could be overly complex, and the amount of information and data that we compile from the initial concept of a design right through to moving into occupation, it's vast. And so there needs to be, and again that's reflected in the Act, a very clear understanding that the information through the golden thread needs to be appropriate in terms of enabling occupiers to manage that building. So there's pertinent and key information that needs to come across, and also the golden thread is there to ensure that the transfer of information from the construction process and handed over to the occupier, and then also if a building is transferred to another organisation, that information is not lost, so that you've got a continuation of that. But it needs to be in a very, very simple format. I mean, the occupiers of the building, the FM managers or the PAP for those buildings, not particularly interested in all of the information that went into the foundation systems and the pile caps and that, which is, again, key information that's required. That's not relevant to the occupation of the building. But obviously the fire strategy for that building is relevant, because if there's any adaptation or to that building, it needs to be considered in terms of that, and that historically is where that information's been lost. But yeah, so we recognising that the regulator needs certain information in terms of certifying buildings, we've come up with a very simple web portal that enables organisations to put that key information into that place, so that when the regulator invites you to submit for application, that information is all held in one place. And that can be also used for the ongoing management of the building across its life cycle.
Okay. And that's the FRMS matrix you're talking about, which people can contact you if they're interested.
Absolutely,
in that.
Yes.
Just to change the subject a little bit. There was a letter was issued, an open letter was issued by the government earlier this summer, and it was from the previous government. Obviously, as we record this, we've recently changed government in the last month or so. But it was from Lee Rowley, Minister for State for Housing and Planning and Building Safety at the time, and also Philip White, Director of Building Safety. And in that letter, it made a statement that if you own, amongst other statements, if you own or manage a high-rise building, and it was referring to the evidence required for a Building Safety Act, for a building safety case, Jamie.
Yeah.
If you own or manage a high-rise building, you should already have been keeping much of the information required for safety case reports. It would be extremely unusual to have none of this information to hand already. And the point they were making is it shouldn't be terribly expensive for most building owners, responsible persons, to pull this information together. Jamie, do you think that's a reasonable statement, or do you think the minister, the Right Honourable Minister, was probably slightly misguided?
How long have we got on this podcast?
As long as you want, Jamie.
It's a fantastic place, isn't it, to assume and wonder that all of this information exists for all of these buildings up and down the country. And, the ideology is that absolutely everyone would have this and it wouldn't be expensive. We know as practitioners, and I'm sure John would concur with this, that the reality is this information doesn't exist. Yeah, you can be lucky, of course. There are the exceptions where the information is available and it's appropriate. But the reality is it doesn't. And I also pick in the letter that it refers to that it isn't necessary to totally revisit these surveys. You don't need to redo things. Well, that's a big ask. We look at the Building Safety Act. Section 35 deals with competence. How do you know the competence of the people who've been collecting that information, writing those reports, unless you've had an eye on that to begin with, as an approving engineer, so to speak, or a consultant working with that information down the line? That's really difficult to make that judgment, and I think many people would be very reluctant to hang their liability on other reports unless they can ratify the quality of that information. We also look at the potential expense from that. The government haven't helped the situation. We look at, as a fire engineering business, the insurance costs that we have, the lack of skills within our industry, which ultimately is pushing wages up. That cost has got to go somewhere. And ultimately that cost is getting pushed onto the client for the ability to produce these reports. So I think to say that it isn't expensive, or it doesn't need to be, from the government, who to some extent have created this situation, where there's been no support with the insurance. So we've seen ridiculous insurance premiums for some that actually couldn't even get insured. So
to give a bit of perspective to what you're saying to some of our listeners who aren't necessarily in the same industry, what the minister was essentially saying was that it'd be very unusual that a building that's been around for 40 years won't have fire strategies, document architectural site plans, all the details that you need to really understand the pathology of a building. And what you're saying, just paraphrasing, is that the building's been around 40 years. Clearly, it's before the digital age. In a lot of cases, it's not going to have this information because it was probably stuck away in a filing cabinet in the 1980s. And that filing cabinet has since gone to the local tip or whatever.
Absolutely.
Nobody knows where this information is. So the truth of the statement from the government is misguided at best and, I don't know, foolish at worst. Yeah,
I think so. Now, I'm sure that the words that have come from government aren't intentionally misleading people.
It's the previous government.
Yeah, of course, sorry. From the previous government, the bad one, who weren't trying to intentionally mislead anyone, of course.
Sure.
But, I've worked on buildings that have been built within the past 10 years where there is absolutely no information available. So I think to make a very brash statement that this information will be available is very brave. I think back even to my days as an enforcer, working for a fire service, we went through a huge exercise of literally binning every file of information we had which was older than 6 years. All went in the bin. I'm sure building control bodies have been in a similar situation, and you could say, yeah, but it's the building owner's responsibility to have all this in place. Yeah, absolutely it is, but unfortunately this is the real world. I think coming onto the sort of systems and like how we record and how we keep this information is really crucial and critical to ensure it is kept.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
But we're not there yet.
No, just to pick up the point on in terms of government, I think the intention of the government, what they were trying to suggest to property owners is that, there may not necessarily be the requirement to go to the extent of some of the investigation work that's happening, but that works on the basis that information is available and is suitable and sufficient for you to be able to put your safety case reports together. I think there's also an emphasis in there around that there are probably some organisations that are trying to game the system, that they're taking commercial advantage of the fact that information is not available, the fact that we've got a shortage in terms of skilled resources in there, therefore supply and demand, therefore they want to rack the prices up, and therefore in some respects some of these things are looking expensive. I think we've both actually seen from one extreme to the other, where you've got prices from that are reasonable to some that are really obscene, to be fair. And so it's right that government makes that point. Interestingly, there's been a recent article that's just come out from central government in terms of how assessing risks in residential property, which came out in August, so this month, in terms of even commenting or questioning the fact that an organisation shouldn't necessarily need to have to employ consultants or specialists in actually putting this information together. Now, I think the primary issue for our industry, which Jamie's already picked up on, is the fact that this information doesn't exist. And until such times as we do a desk analysis to assess the amount of information that the regulator wants to see, so the information that we would ultimately compile and put into the matrix, is simply not there. So we have to then go and collect that information, and that can be very, very complex and very expensive when you're thinking you may have to traverse the external wall system of a building, and you've got all of the costs associated with access. So these things are not cheap. And unfortunately, because our industry has not been good at keeping track of all the information that they have, Regulation 38 was there enshrined in legislation for organisations to pull this information together, but it hasn't been well managed, and it's just been left and then completely
so
lost.
What would be your advice, and I put this to both of you, for an organisation, let's for sake of argument say a small housing organisation, who doesn't know what they need? How do they not get fleeced by people gaming the system? How do they go about getting a gap analysis of what they do and don't need?
I mean, if you're taking a simplistic view, the management of fire safety ultimately has got to start from the top. They've got to have a robust framework for fire safety management within the organisation, which then naturally lends itself to effective management of building safety. And I think what we're seeing more, and I don't know if you're the same, John, is people focusing on the minutiae, actually, rather than looking at the bigger focus of fire safety. So it's all very well to look at how many doors have I got replaced in this building, but actually if you're setting your whole management framework at an organisational level, you'll already have a programme to dealing with that. You would have established the competencies needed to do that. You'd perhaps have the contractors who've gone through the procurement process already. That would have all been sorted. So for my advice is organisational fire risk management has got to be at the priority of being sorted first rather than looking at minutiae.
I think for me the important thing also is around the procurement process. And actually it was something that Dame Judith identified in terms of the recommendations, which led to the working groups that were formulated. And there was a recognition that procurement teams need to be better educated about what it was that they were procuring. And we're still seeing today, 7 years after the tragic event, opportunities come into market where clearly there's a complete lack of understanding of what it is that they're seeking to purchase. And we're having to educate those organisations. In terms of what you're trying to achieve in terms of the Building Safety Act, what you're asking for simply won't get you to that place. So we need better education for procurement teams. We also need to address the fundamental issue that Dame Judith identified around this race to the bottom, because we're now beginning to see more organisations coming into the workplace, into our industry, that historically have never been there before, and they're putting in prices that fundamentally you have to question the competency of the individuals they're going to be using to work on some of these, these very complex buildings. And procurement teams need to have a means of being able to question that price that's been put forward. Just completely seems out of kilter with what the general industry needs, and those need to be challenged.
The whole thing just needs to change from the top to the bottom, doesn't it? Yeah. I mean, we've concentrated very much on the people who manage the buildings, but we know from the Building Safety Act it's more far-reaching than that. And the whole of the industry, the whole of the construction industry is. I think we're moving in the right direction, but we're still a long, long way from it. I have to say this, but even only in the past few days, trying to find product information of certain systems on the outside of building, companies that are very heavily involved within the Grenfell inquiry, to find appropriate fire performance information on products is so difficult, and that's for somebody who knows what they're looking at. So I really feel for people who don't have that knowledge, understanding, and they say tying that up with procurement must be extremely difficult.
Yeah. I think that will be the next that'll be the next big thing that we will hear in the when the phase 2 report comes out. I think the focus on product and product certification is going to feature very heavily within that, and I think you're then in the position where obviously in Dame Judith Hackett's report it said once phase 2 had happened there should be a review of where we're at. Right, there was that kind of reset point at the at the phase 2 report being released, not to undo everything that's been done, but obviously to make sure the direction we're going in is still correct, because obviously you can't assume what that phase 2 report was going to bring. So I think that will certainly be interesting around the product. Do you guys think there's likely to be mission creep for the scope of the Building Safety Act? I mean, do you envisage safety cases for 11 to 18 metres, for example?
I think there's naturally got to be. I think we've got to come away from these delineation points saying that, we're of a building of a high risk over 18, 11, whatever line you want to draw in the sand. Most of our engineers know the historical reasoning and data as to why these lines are there. But why are we assuming then that a 12-metre building is less dangerous than that of an 18? Absolutely. I would argue now that it's turning on its head.
Yeah, of course.
Because it's written in statute how we deal with certain measures now within buildings over 18. That 11 to 18 is grey, and I think they're the trickier buildings to deal with. They take more professional judgment. We see that with the whole EWS1 surveys and things which have happened. To make the judgments on the safety of those buildings where there isn't prescriptive guidance comes down to professional judgment, which means your people doing it have got to be more competent. And I think they're the tricky buildings. So I think there will naturally be creep from this. Yeah. I think we're already seeing it. I think things like the London Plan and what have you, which obviously have higher requirements than that even of statutory legislation. We are seeing that starting to change already, and I only think it's a matter of time before it follows suit. Scotland, that they're ahead of this a little bit in terms of what they require. I naturally think that's going to happen. Yeah,
the Construction Products Association have just released in their summer edition of the construction industry and the forecasts for 24 to 26 have already identified that 11 to 18 metres or 11 metres and above, there's something like 4,374, I think it is, high-rise buildings that have dangerous cladding on them. So just simply by default, there's going to be a lot of activity on buildings from 11 to 18. And out of that sort of 4,000 or so, there is, I think, 50% of them have been remediated. There's another 25% that's in planning. And then there's another 25% that still haven't started yet. That's a lot of buildings that need, and that's just dealing with cladding. When you look at compartmentation issues as well, in line with that, and some of the fire safety issues and other related issues we're seeing in a lot of our existing buildings, for me, it's just a natural move next to bring it down. Fire doesn't discriminate on height. Yeah, a fire will. If you've got dangerous cladding on a building that's up to 11 metres, then you still need to address that. And the Building Safety Act applies to all buildings, irrespective of height. It's only the enhanced regime that's applicable to buildings above 18 metres. And I think for me, there's got to be, if we've got question marks about the robustness of how we're managing buildings above 18 metres, the same issues in Dame Judith's report equally applies to buildings above 11 metres, will actually apply to our industry generally. And we need to see a major step change. So if the controls that have been put in place for 18 and above metres are seen to be effective, then why wouldn't you bring them into the other buildings that are lower in height?
I think it's an interesting point, John, of about what might have been missed in the Building Safety Act and whether there be future modifications to it. John, you wrote an article kind of asking this question this summer about published in Life magazine about have we overlooked asbestos risks in the Building Safety Act because it's not mentioned in the BSA, and the thrust of your article was that there's over 5,000 asbestos related deaths every year in the UK, including mesothelioma, lung cancer and asbestosis. In comparison, the number of deaths from fatalities from fire is significantly small. I'm just trying to see the actual number just to compare.
Last year,
it's usually between 200 and 300.
Yeah, last year it to September of 2023 it was 278, I believe,
so
compared to the year before,
nearly 20 times more per year fatalities per year through asbestos. Yet we're talking about the Building Safety Act doesn't even mention asbestos.
The emphasis of my article was really to get organisations to think about the associated issues in terms of the remediation of these buildings, and not to lose sight of the fact that asbestos is still a major issue in terms of residential buildings. I also recognise that the HSE, there's very robust controls in place for management of asbestos, and that those need to be recognised. But I think because there's been such a focus on fire safety and the costs associated with that, it seems to me as though asbestos is being given a bit of a backseat.
The poor relation to fire safety.
Now, obviously, when you look at the number of fatalities, and I know that this will be considered as being a historic issue that we're seeing the effect of because it takes 30, 40 years for it to manifest itself. The issue is that we still got, I think, something like 500 million tonnes of asbestos still in our existing buildings that we need to manage and be aware of. So if we're opening up buildings to do investigation work, we need to be conscious of the fact that could in itself create a cross-contamination problem and expose a number of occupants to asbestos fibres within the atmosphere, which will potentially manifest themselves in asbestos-related disease at some point in the future. So we need to control this. Now, there was an article that was produced by ATAC in conjunction with NORAC, which are the organisations that look after asbestos, and they looked at a million lines of data that was gathered from 130,000 buildings in relation to asbestos. Of that, there was 78% of those buildings, of that data, that had asbestos in them. 85% of those related to residential buildings. So we need to be conscious of the fact that these materials exist. And for me, I think the Act had the opportunity to raise this, at least mention that this needed to be considered in relation to any remediation work that may happen. There is provision within the Act, I think it's under Section 62, where the regulator can request make further recommendations in terms of that. So hopefully that, together with water management, which is another issue around Legionella in our existing buildings, some of these things need to be considered. And I think for me, it would have been good at least they had a mention within the Act so that it raised awareness.
Put it back on the table.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because in theory, what you're saying is all of the work that's being done now could be creating a 30-year lead on mesothelioma deaths increasing again, potentially once this current spate has decreased based on the way it was historically looked after 30, 40 years ago, which is interesting. Do you anticipate, Jamie, that social housing organisations, councils and traditional housing associations, do you think they might have to start thinking about reducing services just to pay for some of the Building Safety Act elements, remediation, for example, and consultancy services and general management around fire safety and general safety now the BSA's arrived?
I don't think they anticipated the costs and budgets that would be required to satisfy what they now need to do. Now, I'm not a budget holder of these organisations, but one would assume that where there's a balance, tip in one way, as in there's more funds required to remediate buildings, fix buildings from a fire safety point of view, that, as the layman, naturally means to me that there's got to be a reduction elsewhere, unless, of course, there's either an increase of injection of funds from somewhere, whether that's from central government or the residents, however that looks, being different to each association. But for me, naturally, the balance is tipping and there's going to be a reduction in services elsewhere. That's my layman's view on it.
Yeah, it's already happening. The regulator for social housing in their most recent report has identified that there's been a significant shift in terms of available spend that's moved into currently cladding remediation, which is having an impact in terms of new build construction. So they're having to shift what reserves that they have to address all of the issues that they are. They've also identified in the year to the first quarter of this year to 24 that there was 79 billion that was spent on repairs, maintenance and fire-related expenditure. And they anticipate the forecast going forward for the next 12 months is that that's going to increase. I think it's something like 95 billion. So there's a lot of money that's being sent in this direction, and that will have a knock-on effect in terms of new build. And I think the forecast on that is that it's going to slow down this year by about 10%, and then it will only grow by about 3% in 2025. So there is a fundamental shift. The other issues that social housing providers have to grapple with is not just about fire safety and remediation. We've got decarbonisation that needs to be addressed. You've got the green energy issue as well that needs to be addressed. There's mould and damp, which is getting a lot of press at the moment. So they're having to grapple
resident
with
engagement issues.
A significant amount of spend.
Yeah. And
it's also going to get more expensive for them to fund these, because a lot of them will need to raise funding by refinancing. And when you consider since 2020, we've had 14 interest rate increases.
Yeah.
We've gone from a place of 0.1% at its lowest position. I know it's now at 5% because the Bank of England have just reduced it slightly. But refinancing when you was in a position that you may have borrowed when the interest rates were extremely low, to then refinancing at a higher level is going to have another impact on the availability of funding that they have to address some of these issues. So it's a real challenge for them.
Yeah. And then twin that with the increased cost of contractors and consultants because of the pressure on resources, it becomes a perfect storm, doesn't it?
And material costs.
And material costs increase as well, absolutely. Yeah.
There's probably some settling there as well. I think when we look back to when all this was first kicking off, local authorities were throwing away procurement rules. Ultimately, there was a shortage of people, and they needed people in to do jobs. Yeah. And I'm not saying it then became the Wild West in terms of charging, but it was, there were fees being certainly quoted, which was, I suppose, respective and relevant at the time, but it wasn't going through that procurement process. There wasn't fair competition, but I think now that's more going through, that's being closed down, and certainly people are being expected to be on frameworks with set pricing expectations. So I can see, I think, the general costs to housing authorities from a consultancy perspective, at least, coming down. Of course, remediation is still still a big elephant in the room, but at least we would expect we're at this stage now where any contractors who are contributing to that are on those frameworks, are reputable, and of course not having to redo works because they are reputable. As we've seen as consultants, in the early stages we were redoing other people's work because it literally was, who can we get? So yeah, I'm hoping that will settle down a bit.
John, I'll ask you this separately in a second, Jamie. But when we last spoke back at the start of the series, when you last came on as a guest, we talked at some length about the new website backdraftmovie.com that you were due to join up as part of the Backdraft fan club.
Have I not joined up yet, Dave?
I haven't seen an application form. I just want to remind you, John, that you also automatically become a member of the Paul McCaffrey Appreciation Society, and you will get a photograph of Kurt Russell once a month, no context, emailed directly to you.
And have you decided whether that's going to be the same photograph or
it will be a different photograph each month?
Okay, that's great.
I
may be tempted then.
Okay.
I may be tempted.
Jamie, this is obviously new to you.
Yeah, it is new to me. The prospect of this sounds incredibly exciting, and I think I need to put it on the public record now today that I will sign up to the club.
This is the level of enthusiasm I wanted, and it's nice
Yeah.
to see Part B picking up. And
It's what I've always liked about them, Dave.
yeah,
Actually, is their commitment.
and their enthusiasm to
Commitment,
1991 movies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really difficult to now go back to important questions.
Oh, that was my way of starting to wrap up the episode.
Oh, okay, fantastic.
Producer over there was kind of
Getting cross,
yeah, looking
as
at her
ever,
watch and-
because when she's not doing break dancing, she's looking at her watch.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much to Jamie and to John. Very illuminating guys. It's the building safety, obviously a subject we're going to go back to multiple times. It is the new landscape that we're working within.
Yeah, and I think the world needs to know more about it. I think, and this is an opportunity for people to hear about it.
Interestingly, Tom, you started this episode by commenting about that everybody knows about the Building Safety Act. The reality is
They don't. No.
We still have, and I'm sure you've got clients saying to us, "Oh, we understand. There's this Building Safety Act thing that we now need to comply with."
Yeah, what's that?
What's that?
Yeah.
So it's
Well,
there's
it's
still
not being considered, John. The concept of the safety act. Sorry, what's that?
Yeah.
We're still there. It's
Well, I think it's interesting when we spoke to Dame Judith Hackett when she started to talk about how she was engaged to review building regulations, and there were ministers who would question her ability to do that because she didn't know any of the detail about the Grenfell Tower fire, which obviously is two completely different things. Yep. Obviously, the review of building regulations fundamentally falls out of the fact we had that fire at all, but her role was completely isolated from that situation as a fresh set of eyes to look at how that could happen, not the nuts and bolts of the actual fire on the day, which is obviously Samaya Morbick's task with the Grenfell Tower inquiry. And I think people forget that. And obviously that's part of what she said to us was you don't need to be an expert in the Grenfell Tower fire to look constructively at the building regulatory environment and to identify whether that is appropriate or not to protect us from something like that happening again. So the interchangeability of language of the Building Safety Act, Building a Safer Future, the Grenfell Tower inquiry, those three documents I think are so interchangeable. People just talk about them like they're the same, or they talk about the wrong one at the wrong time. And I think it's important that people start to realise that. And I think we'll try to push that more as a theme through the podcast.
There needs to be a major culture shift, and that was what came out of Dame Judith's initial report. There are some organisations that are leading in that, in trying to make that change, that significant change. Part B ourselves and CLM are very much at driving that campaign
and
forward.
we should say there are a lot of other
they are.
competitors and allied
Yeah,
companies
absolutely.
we work with, and they're welcome to come on this podcast. I think we just want to reiterate that this isn't a closed club.
No.
Not my competitors.
If you know what you're talking about.
But we do have some way to go to make that shift.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we'll call it a day there. As the great Gerald Springer once said, take care of yourselves
And each other.
and each other.
I think what I just wanted to make sure is we all understand that we are completely independent, and if anyone wants to get involved, they can message us on LinkedIn and follow our page. We would love to hear from you. If you'd like to appear on the show in future or comment on anything that we've said in the past, then drop us a message and we will bring you down to our studio to re-inform you of our position. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
That's good.